But I will say this. He said, I have cousins named Seamus, which is refreshing for me because when I've met President Clinton a couple of times, he always talks about his dog named Seamus. I often get dogs. I don't often get cousins.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
All right, welcome back to Canusa Street. I'm Scotty Greenwood from the Canadian American Business Council, and I'm joined by my favorite partner in crime, Chris Sands at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Hey, Chris.
Hi, Scotty.
So we've got a great podcast yet again. We are delighted to welcome to Canusa Street Canadian Minister of Labour, the Honourable Seamus O'Regan. And I know you're going to introduce him properly in a second, Chris, but I just want to say how excited I am to see the minister. I seem to only see him, in places like we were in New York at the premiere of Come From Away on Broadway a few years ago, which was amazing. And as a Newfoundlander, I know that the Come From Away show, we can talk about what that was about, is really special. So I like to see the minister in those kind of circumstances. We were going to see him in Washington this week as we record this, and he couldn't travel, but he was able to do a roundtable about work on electric vehicles. But in the middle of the roundtable, Chris, the minister stepped away for a quick vote in the House of Commons in Ottawa, and it was very successful. So maybe you can ask him about that as well. I know he's working really hard. So with that, let me turn it over to you to introduce the minister, and then, Minister, we will chit-chat for as long as you'll have us.
Excellent. Well, Scotty, this is an exciting conversation. Not only is Seamus O'Regan the new Minister of Labour, and his mandate letter came out the day that we're recording this, so he's got his marching orders. But he's already achieved one of his marching orders in getting 10 days of paid leave approved unanimously in Parliament. So we'll bug him about that. But he's not just a new Minister of Labour. He's a former Minister of Natural Resources. He's a Minister of Indigenous Services and Veterans Affairs, and was actually an Associate Minister of National Defence. He comes from, his riding is St. John's, South Mount Pearl in Newfoundland. And Canadians know him, and I actually can say that I have been in my pajamas with him because he used to host the CTV morning program, and thankfully it wasn't a two-way screen because you wouldn't like my pajamas, Minister, but he's a wonderful person. He spent time studying politics at St. Francis Xavier University, but also studied at University College Dublin. He studied at INSEAD near Paris and has a Master of Philosophy degree from the University of Cambridge in England. So a worldly person, a great portfolio of politics. Really glad to have you, Minister. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris. Although, you got to be careful with all this talk about me and you meeting in your pajamas. I'm a married man. My husband is going to be watching this with some chagrin.
We don't want to start any rumors.
I did morning television for 10 years, and more or less how I think, I know you both in some respect. And I love that a great deal, although I will be the first to say that having, knowing the correct questions to ask is altogether different than providing answers, especially when you're a politician. But anyway, I do my best.
And Minister, you started in the media business as a 10-year-old, I think I read, when you were a little kid. Is that a fiction on Wikipedia, or is that real?
It's real. It's real. Yeah. I did radio plays for CBC in Newfoundland. And anyway, there was a national radio morning show, current affairs for young people called Anybody Home. And they asked me to participate in that. I thought it was crazy because it aired the same time as Saturday morning cartoons. I mean, we're talking about the 70s and 80s here. Like, well, who would be listening to this? But I did it because it paid well.
Oh.
And I became a member of the actor union at a very young age. So maybe that portended to my present role as well. I don't know.
Well, maybe. But so, Chris, I just have one other question as we start up here. Minister, what made you make the jump then from media? Because you got to be very famous in Canada and an acclaimed...
Very famous in Canada is kind of a very qualified statement.
Well, but then you jumped into politics. So what made you make that jump? Maybe that's well known to others, but I've actually never asked you that.
Well, it's actually kind of what made me jump into media because when I was 21, I was executive assistant to the Minister of Justice in Newfoundland and Labrador, And so I worked 3 years with him. Then I went away to Dublin to study what Newfoundland could learn from the Celtic Tiger in Ireland. And then came back, and I was 2 years then senior policy advisor to the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. So and then went away to Cambridge and studied Indigenous participation and natural resource development. So it was more like, how did I leave politics, even though I was a staffer, not an elected official like I am now, and go into media? And I will just briefly tell you that because it's a good story. I had a master's in philosophy degree, which meant naturally I was living in my parents' basement after my graduation with my auspicious degree. And my brother, who served in the military, he just retired recently as lieutenant commander in the Navy. But at the time, he wanted to fly from Dubai, where he was stationed, to go to Halifax in Nova Scotia, obviously. He's going to stop over at our family home in St. John's and pick up his Jeep from the family home and drive it all the way across the island to Halifax. My mother implored me, said, for God's sake, we need somebody to go on Moose Watch. In Newfoundland, this is a serious business. We have a number of accidents that happen, and from moose and people hitting moose straying on the highway in front of. So you need somebody who's on Moose Watch. So I was going to go. I got a call from an old friend of mine, and she was working for CTV, which is the big private broadcaster in Canada. And they were starting a new channel and a new show where they were looking for people who were just going to talk endlessly for like 6 hours a day about current affairs. And she said, we think you'd be perfect. They asked me to go to Halifax. I said, are you going to pay my way? They said, no. So I said, forget it. Then I said, well, I happen to be going to Halifax because I got to go on Moose Watch with my brother. And so I appeared in front of some cameras. This is a pre-internet. So, they put it on a DVD and couriered that to Toronto. And the executives there saw it and said, hey, we'd love for you to come. I want you to pay my way. They said, yes. So I thought, hey, free trip to Toronto. Went, and they said, we'd like to have you on. And anyway, my brother, years later, when everybody was making a big fuss because the Canada kind of famous in Canada guy was at his wedding, he stood up and he said, if it wasn't for me and the moose, none of this would have happened. If it wasn't for him and the moose, none of it would have happened. So
that might be one of the most
enjoyed 15 years on national television as a result and loved every minute of it. It was an unbelievable experience. And prided myself on learning a heck of a lot, and pride myself to this day on being a journalist. It was marvelous. And it was, thank goodness for him and the moose.
Yeah.
It's a very Canadian story.
I was just saying that. I mean, it's one of the most Canadian stories. It doesn't even seem real. But anyway, you left journalism and got into politics. So maybe I should turn it over to Professor Sands to ask like a proper, serious political or policy
question.
It's
only relevant if it involves Canadian wildlife, Professor.
Well, I guess it's wildlife. You're Minister of Labor. And, it's one of those jobs that people think about. Maybe this is the future of the workforce. Maybe it's something like that. But there's a Minister for Workforce Development separate from Minister of Labor. So how is your remit? We've got the mandate letter, but what is it that the Labor Ministry at the federal level does? And I know that's a very basic question, but just to understand what it is you're doing in the Government of Canada for our listeners.
Yeah, well, the Ministry of Labor is actually one of our oldest ministries, and it deals specifically right now with organized labor, particularly. Mm-hmm. We're a government that took our relationship with organized labor extremely seriously because, we honed in on the middle class and those working hard to join it. In much the same way as, you look at Presidents Clinton, for instance, or President Obama and, currently President Biden. There is, you want to hone in on that group, not only because I think it's the right thing to do, because the majority of Americans, Canadians occupy that kind of fairly elusive demographic, but also because you hit the most number of people when you affect the middle class, and therefore it's good for an economy. Organized labor, we've really identified as being key. And I think, what you're seeing, and I think President Biden was wise, but even, you look at people on kind of the different side of the political spectrum in our country, and I'm thinking particularly of Premier Ford in Ontario of the Progressive Conservative Party. They have been honing in on organized labor. If you can, make sure that people have the right working conditions, if you can make sure that they are paid a reasonable wage and they have the right benefits, they will contribute to the economy. They will drive an economy. So that, that has been a particular part of my remit. One other thing that you may have noticed in my mandate letter too, Christopher, is on what we call just transition. You guys call it the same, and I think there are many of us who hate the phrase equally. It doesn't resonate with people, and I say that because, I say it because we know what we're talking about. We're talking about energy workers and kind of a displacement that's happening in the market as we look at lowering emissions and building up renewables. But it makes so many people who work in the energy sector so anxious because it just seems like this grand sweeping thing. And in fact, it's about retooling to the next job. If we have workers who are working in oil and gas, working in hydrogen, or even, like one head of the crane operators union in Alberta told me, like, if my guys are lifting a wind turbine or lifting a pipeline, whatever, we just got to make sure that those good jobs remain, that they, more often than not are union jobs, and that we retool them properly to the next thing. So to answer your question, yeah, I mean, we work more broadly on this. I mean, this is going to be something that's going to involve a whole load of ministries. If you could also see in my mandate letter, and I co-lead it with the Minister of Natural Resources. There are some things that, envelop the entire government. I would say this is one of them on the economic side. And if you look at mandate letters, reconciliation is something of Indigenous people or with Indigenous people is something that we have, is kind of a whole of government thing. And we're a good group. I mean, I've seen a lot of governments and, either at a staff level or whatever, been involved with a lot of governments. This is a really good group of people. And, we respect each other's turf, but also know we can work properly together. So labor, my tentacles, are throughout many different jurisdictions, as are others in mine. So, it's just all that to say that we work. I'm not a myopic guy. I'm a results-oriented guy, and wherever I can work with other people, that's really important.
So let me follow up on that. Thank you for that. Mandate letter is a Canadian thing. Americans, cabinet members I don't think get mandate letters, or it's not a hotly anticipated day in the news here. But I do know, Minister, that you met just recently, maybe in this past week as we're recording this, with your U.S. counterpart, who at Canadian American Business Council, we were happy to have him participate in our State of the Relationship. But if you're not from Boston, he's a little hard to understand. Marty Walsh, the former mayor. So how was your conversation with him? Is there collaboration between the two of you, or was it just a courtesy call? Like, how do you see Canada-U.S. collaboration on your portfolio? Or your mandate.
I'll take a step back and I'll share another story. Okay, so when you talk about Marty's accent, I mean, he's got a fairly thick Boston brogue. But I have a Newfoundland accent. Now, I don't always have it. It's my real accent, I call it. But when I grew up in Labrador, at a base there, which was occupied with, Americans and Canadians, from mainland Canada, and Dutch and Germans and Brits, and there were, all these air forces. My mother taught us then, speak slowly for the mainlanders. So I learned this kind of other way that I'm talking with you now that paid off very well, getting into Canadian morning television. So when Marty speaks in his Boston accent, I just speak in my Newfoundland accent, and we both understand each other very well. We both, my accent's faster and more of a Waterford-Wexford lilt. I think the Boston thing is its own thing, but I understand it perfectly.
You're going to have to give us a little of it.
You can't put it on. You can't put it on. It's there. It's not there. What can I tell you? But I will say this. He said, I have cousins named Seamus, which is refreshing for me because when I've met President Clinton on a couple of times, he always talks about his dog named Seamus. I often get dogs. I don't often get cousins. So Marty and I hit it off very well. He also wanted to talk a lot about hockey. Unfortunately, we both like the same team. Well, I don't know if he likes them. He's a Boston fan, but he knows Montreal well, Montreal Canadiens. So I frankly exhausted my knowledge on that. But we spoke about that. Looking forward to seeing him. Told him I'd love to have him up in Newfoundland, particularly. And it's unfortunate. We were meant to be in DC. I was greatly looking forward to meeting with him. I think one of the things about post-COVID or living with COVID, actually more to the point, is just how much you love seeing people. Like I was looking forward to seeing you, Scotty, again, no question. And, anyway, we had to, with Omicron, we've had to batten down the hatches again. I'm hoping in Q1 to get back and do it live again and looking forward to seeing him down there. You miss that, and it is, I think, an integral part of diplomacy. I mean, I'm very grateful for this. In my 2 years as natural resources minister, almost all of it was spent on Zoom. Frustrating, because when I started, my previous positions, Christopher lined up Veterans Affairs. I visited every Legion Hall in Canada. Indigenous Services, just, hit as many First Nations and many rural and remote parts of this country as I could. That's where I grew up, so I had to do it. And then when I took natural resources, they were like, well, you're going to have to go to all these conferences now in Vienna, and Santiago, and Paris. And I was thinking, God, that's great. And COVID meant I did it all, from my home in Newfoundland. But grateful for this. But I think it's an integral part of our relationship and of diplomacy. And I think no matter what your line of work, to see people in the flesh and to shake their hand and to talk to them, you can't beat it. So I think this has maintained our relationship, and I'm looking forward to getting back down.
Well, yeah. And one of the most magical experiences and memorable experiences of my professional life, actually, traveling in Canada. I've been all throughout Canada, but was in Newfoundland in the summer, where we saw an iceberg floating by, and it actually tipped over, and it was green. You could hear the sound, and we saw it, and it was green, until the seawater drained. And so if you can replicate that and invite, organize it so that your counterparts are present for an iceberg tipping over, it says a lot about climate change, but it also is just a magical experience of nature. Anyway, Chris, I digress.
Intersection which was in Newfoundland, we had a beach party on the final day of our 3-day, anyway, because we had a lot of people who came in from all over the world. I really wanted to show off Newfoundland, and at the final night at the beach party, I screamed out, "Release the whales." Some people looked at me like I was serious. And I was like, we don't keep them on a harness and, cue the approach. But you were lucky because, icebergs flipping. Basically, what they say about icebergs is true. 80-90% is underwater. But eventually the salt erodes it. And then it reaches literally that tipping point and it flips over. Not many people get to see it. I've only seen it a couple of times myself, and I live there. So
yeah, it's magical. And I got to tell you, it was wasted. I was standing there with my boss at the time, Ambassador Giffen, and it was the most romantic, magical experience. And I'm standing there with the dude I work for. So that was no good. Anyway, Chris, bring us back to reality here, my friend.
Well, I don't know if it's reality. I'm enjoying your world here for a minute. But I did have a somewhat serious question, because a lot of times with labor, certainly U.S. Department of Labor, what we think of is workplace safety, and whether it was the miners a generation ago to auto plants, so on, a lot of our workplace safety issues, a lot of our organized labor, I should say, the labor unions made a real difference in making work less deadly, and I think that was a really important step. But now we're dealing with COVID and the pandemic, and you mentioned Omicron, and from your vantage point, how can Canada address the change in the labor market? The idea that, some people, usually white-collar people like me, I know, can telework, but not everybody can telework. So we've got first responders, we've got people taking real risks to do their jobs. And I wonder, what can government do to try to mitigate that, to try to take care of people? Because you shouldn't lose your life just to earn a living.
And you shouldn't have to choose between buying your groceries, paying your rent, paying your mortgage, and taking time off when you think you may be symptomatic. So to your point and what we talked about at the beginning, I think 10 days of paid leave is a big help. I got a lot of work to do with my provincial colleagues and territorial colleagues in Canada, because the 94% of it is under their jurisdiction. So we got a lot of work to do. We need to do it fairly quickly, because if there's not another variant, then there will probably be another pandemic, and we want to make sure that we're well equipped for it. And we've learned this. If we can keep people from going to work when they feel that they may have symptoms, that is going to be a big help. So that's one of those things. I would argue too that there are other things that we have learned outside of the pandemic. I think one part of my remit is dealing with mental health. And making that an integral part of being able to take time off, but also, occupational health and safety, that mental health be part of that. That will be, when I was in media, when I was a journalist, I was an ambassador for a big campaign that one of our big major telecom companies has here, Bell, called Bell Let's Talk. I was an ambassador for Bell Let's Talk. And I'm somebody who has suffered through depression and anxiety, and so it's a big passion of mine. And that will occupy some of my time. We have our first minister dedicated to mental health as a result of this new government. That's Dr. Carolyn Bennett, who's also a former minister of public health, but more recently, spent basically the past 6 years as Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. Carolyn's a dear friend, so I'll be working closely with her on that too.
Well, that's impressive, and good luck to you on it, because it is really important work. But you did mention the provinces, and just as a follow up, the way it always seems to go in Canada, you have a federal government of one stripe, and then you tend to have provincial governments of the other stripe. I think voters sometimes split things up. As we come out of COVID, what would you say the state of federal-provincial relations are? And if you could affect one thing and get the provinces on board with one thing, what would you prioritize? There's so much to do these days.
Yeah, I think not to belabor it, but I think 10 days of 10 days of paid sick leave is probably going to be one of my first things to discuss with them, and working on arrangements with them on that. But I mean, there is a host of other things. I like hitting the road, and I was really eager to do that because I could do that after I was brought in. Within days, within 2 days, I was meeting with my Ontario colleague, Marty McNaughton, and to your point, a progressive conservative minister. He texted me the night I was sworn in, and and I will say that 2 years previous, when I was Minister of Natural Resources, and we were the Liberal Party of Canada was shut out of Alberta and Saskatchewan. I received a text that night from the Minister of Energy from Alberta saying, "When will you come?" And I said, "How's tomorrow?" And flew out there, and she and I still have a very, very tight relationship. Saw each other through the dual crises of a pandemic on our energy resources. Again, Canada being the fourth largest oil producer in the world, U.S. being number one, and also an oil price war that shocked both of our economies. So we saw each other through quite a bit. I work very hard, to work with my colleagues. And I don't care what political stripe that they are. I say to them, when I campaign, I am a total partisan, a rabid partisan. But when I'm in a position where I'm governing, if I'm fortunate enough to be in this position, you're working for our common constituents and for the good of the country. And I mean that. I really do. And I think I've, gotten some credibility on that. So I work that in natural resources. I'm working that in labor, and met with my Alberta colleagues as well, Tyler Shandro, and regardless of stripe. So I think that there are some things that we will definitely be working on together. Some things that that are of interest to them, like labor mobility, that I'm really interested in working on. We have our federations are somewhat different. I think that we are a little more decentralized than yours. And so a lot of power does reside, particularly on domestic matters with provinces and territories. So it's incumbent, if you're going to show national leadership, that we do that. And I think in an increasingly globalized world, we're still a population of California. So while you have to respect jurisdictions as the fathers of Confederation wrote it, it is the 21st century, and where you can coordinate and work together. You got to do that because our partners and our competitors are very good at doing that. And, we got to be united.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Scotty?
Well, I can vouch. I know we're wrapping up here, Minister, and we're so grateful to you.
Are you serious?
Well, I mean, it's your time.
Time flies when you're having fun,
dude. We can talk all day long if you want. I can vouch for your nonpartisan approach in governing and federal provincial, because behind your back, the province of Alberta has a former colleague of yours, James Rajat, who's now the former federal member of Parliament, now the Alberta representative in D.C. I've worked a lot with him. Chris has worked some with him too, and James sings your praises. And, I'm sure his Irish ancestors call him Seamus. So you guys are brothers from another mother. But
James is English for Seamus. That's how it goes.
Exactly right. And I have to say, being in Washington, D.C., your admonition to fight as hard as you can on the campaign trail, but then work for the common good once you're governing, is something that resonates with me. And I don't know, maybe in your next life you'll come down in Washington and help our policymakers understand that kind of approach, because it's pretty fractured here. It's pretty rough and tumble. And let me just have you react to this for a second. One of the things that has been smart that Canada does, and that the Prime Minister and the team have really stepped up here in recent weeks, is not only engaging with counterparts in the White House. It's not just about the leader to leader, but also talking to Congress, because President Biden can't just do a deal with any world leader. He's also got to work things through Congress. So I know that the government of Canada has spent a fair amount of time here lately, because I see you guys all the time talking to Congress. So I wonder if you want to spend a moment. A big issue is electric vehicle tax credit. I wonder, just as we get to the end, and again, we'll talk as long as you want to hang out with us on Canusa Street, Minister, but if you want to talk a little bit about that outreach, because I know you and your colleagues are focused on that, not just with the White House, but with Congress.
Yeah. The idea of a 34% tax credit on, all American made electric vehicles is incredibly destructive to the auto pact. It is the equivalent, let's not parse words here. It's the equivalent of a 34% tariff. And let's also be clear about something else. There is no such thing as an all-American made car. And there is no such thing as an all-Canadian made car. It's actually almost parity. It's 50%, 50%. Just because, you have automotive parts and partially assembled vehicles that can 6, 7, 8, 9 times cross the border. It is an integrated market. It's worked well. It's happened that way because on both sides of the border, we have competitive advantages in particular areas that come together to make a car. Mm-hmm. And together, we got to compete against Germans, Japanese, Koreans, global competitors, Brazilian. And this is how we've done it. And this auto pact has served both of our countries very well, with a lot of excellent, highly paid union jobs on both sides of the border. So, I get that, and this is the point about just transition and everything else. We need to make sure that workers are on side, because workers are the ones who make the cars, the electric vehicles. Workers are going to be the ones to lower emissions and build up renewables. This isn't a matter of will workers be at the table. I say to union leadership here, you are it. I mean, we're just trying to enable you. Who the heck do you think is going to do this work? This is all complex stuff. So I get, in order to bring that constituency over, and I applaud this administration for focusing on organized labor, as are we, which, makes this all the more tragic that we would even be talking about differences on this. But you can't allow Canadian labor to be collateral damage. I can't have it. And we will retaliate in kind.
I don't think it's going to come to that.
That is just foolishness, I think, when you think about how aligned these governments are on organized labor and on our commitment to combating climate change in real and tangible ways. I mean, we've already said that we will not have, any manufactured internal combustion engine cars in Canada in 2030. I mean, this is huge. That's why this is pressing, and that's why we got to get it right now, and that's why we are serious when we say we will retaliate. Because but again, all the more tragic. I am really hopeful that does not happen. We got to do what we got to do, but we are so aligned on this that I'm really hopeful, and I'm confident that we will find a way forward.
I think so too, Minister. I think that's very well said. We hear your passion and your seriousness about this, and I think this thing is going to get resolved. Luckily,
by the time people hear this, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll be our version of the mandate letter. By the time people hear it, the problem will be solved.
In which case, I am going to be on this show every week.
Heck, why not? We don't need any other guests, Sands. We got Minister O'Regan. Well, listen, let me just say thank you. It's pretty great for me to be able to see you twice in 2 days, Minister, and talk to you. And I hope we can continue it. And Chris, it's always good to get together with you and have these important conversations.
Well, and I feel it's really exciting to talk to the minister when I'm wearing, professional clothes, not just my pajamas. So this is exciting.
And go see Come From Away. And if you've already seen it, see it again, because it is fantastic. I mean, that night that I saw Scotty, the Prime Minister and Sophie had invited, I think, all the UN ambassadors to go see it. And it speaks volumes about our relationship, during a really pivotal time in American history and world history, what happened in Gander, Newfoundland. I mean, set to music. I never in my life thought that they could make a musical about 9/11 and what happened in Gander, Newfoundland. But they did. And boy, I tell you, people come out of it dancing, crying, laughing. It's the stuff of genius. And
that's exactly right. And actually, I think, Chris, you might have been there this summer in Washington on the anniversary of 9/11, late summer. There was, well, Chris, you described what happened at the Lincoln Memorial, because maybe we'll get the minister to come back for that.
Oh, that was great. They did a version of the entire musical on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So people could gather safely outside, sit on the grass in a blanket and listen to the songs and the stories. And there were some screens to make some of the singer actors more visible. And it was almost like a radio play. You might, your 10-year-old self might have enjoyed this, because they didn't have all the staging and the sets. So they worked it almost as a reading but it was really powerful. And to be in that spot, and the Reagan Airport, not named after you, is nearby. Yeah, extra in there. The planes would go by overhead, and you're thinking 9/11, and then you watch these planes in the sky. It was just such a moving moment. And you're right. I think it tells a great story about our people, but also tells you something about how nice and decent and fair-minded the people of Newfoundland are. And you certainly fit in that category as far as I can tell.
Well, and Ambassador Hillman that night addressed the crowd. It was like a free concert on the Mall in Washington. It was brilliant. And she addressed a crowd of thousands and thousands of people, and no other Canadian ambassador in Washington has been able to get that many people to focus on Canada-US. So it was a beautiful moment, and I would like it to become an annual event. Actually, that should be something that people in Washington look forward to. They bring their families, and maybe we can bring half of Newfoundland down to celebrate with us, Minister.
250,000 Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. Buckle up, Washington.
We're ready.
And I look forward to it next time. Look forward to seeing you in person.
You're always welcome here, too.
Thank you so much.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.